Okay, so this is going to be my third Adopt a Landscape assignment, and I'm going to talk about the applications of GIS in the HRM and in landscape ecology in general. So here's just a refresher on what my chosen landscape is. It is the HRM, Halifax Regional Municipality, and kind of like the surrounding communities are all facing similar challenges and have similar features. So my landscape is my hometown located on the east coast of Canada in Nova Scotia. Assignment 3 is on landscape ecology tools, and I have specifically chosen to focus on geographic information systems, which is GIS. We're going to talk about what it is, how it works, what kind of applications can it have in landscape ecology, and then finally I'm going to apply it to the HRM, and we're going to look at a case study that isn't in the HRM, but it's in an environment, a coastal ecosystem similar to Halifax, and a lot of the methods and tools that they use in that study will carry over to future research that would benefit the HRM. Okay, so what is GIS? GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems. It is a computer-based framework that is used for gathering, managing, and analyzing data. It is not a software. It's a framework that uses programs and softwares such as ArcGIS or R, and it's a visual representation of geographic information. GIS is essential to modern ways of understanding what has happened, what is currently happening, and what could potentially happen in the future within geographic space. I would like to carefully highlight the differences between geographic representation and cartographic representation because GIS is not cartography. GIS is not making maps. They are separate, yet have always been kind of interdisciplinary. When they come together, we create models that portray and communicate a purpose. So geographic representation is the specific process of abstracting observations of the world into things which are static or events which are, a state of a process in relation to the landscape, whereas cartographic representation involves the process of symbolizing the geographic representation and communicating it. So, geographic representation is selection of observations, measurements, and choices about like coding of attributes and relationships in a database, whereas the cartographic representation is the selection of graphical elements and the abstraction of the geographic information to communicate it and represent it for a purpose. So geographic information is not necessarily the geographic data. Geographic data is the raw recordings of measurements, but we take this raw data and we make it information by using relationships and comparison and by creating a purpose using models and visual representations of geographic information. So information is the data that means something. So GIS uses data collected from satellites, drones, aerial photos, GPS, or other tools that are used to collect geographic data. And once that data is collected, it is categorized into either raster or vector data. Raster data is a form of geographic representation in which space is fixed, and the amount or degree of an attribute in that space is measured, where vector data is the attribute is fixed, while the space it occupies is being measured. So attributes are characteristics and qualities of things and events in the representation of the collected data. So raster and vector data are layered and combined within programs such as ArcGIS or R to create a manipulatable map or a scene that depicts this information. So once this data is digitized, imported, and categorized, there are fundamental things to first think about before exploring the geographic information. We need to think about what kind of map we're making. Is it going to be a thematic map or a topographic map? We need to think about projections and distortions and scale and coordinate systems based on the area that we are looking to represent. Assigning attributes is also important. So what characteristics and qualities of things and events are going to be included, and then like you can symbolize all of these different attributes and layer them on top of each other depending on what kind of map you're making. But GIS is manipulatable and interactive, so you can make one map with the data, or you can totally create a new one. Like, there's endless possibilities. You're not just stuck to a paper map where there's only that one set of things being represented. You can zoom in and zoom out and move around and add things or take away things. It's very interactive. All right, so why is GIS useful in landscape ecology? So GIS allows you to perform analyses, analyze patterns, and use proximity, among other things. But by manipulating all of these features, users interact with the data and tailor it to get a visual output that is very specific and representative of an attribute that they're trying to discuss. So GIS is not, the same as cartography, as traditional maps on paper. GIS is interactive, so it can be manipulated, and the data can be layered upon, and you can zoom in and zoom out and move around and highlight one aspect of the data at one time and then choose another aspect to highlight, right? All of these drop down menus are screenshots from within ArcGIS, and these are all under the Perform Analysis tab, and these are the different examples of the different things that you can do to manipulate the data to tailor the visual output to support, a research hypothesis or to communicate a specific message. So just kind of like broad examples, you can use polygons to represent a species geographic range, or you could use sampling points to represent individual sightings. And the organization of multiple layers of information allows researchers in landscape ecology to see the deeper insights into these patterns and relationships and situations that are happening across the landscape that is being analyzed. Now that we know what GIS is and how it works, hopefully, sort of, I'm going to talk about some applications of GIS in the HRM. So for my essay for assignment 2, I discussed the concern for sea level rise in the Halifax Harbor, and that more recent conservation efforts are shifting towards preserving natural coastal ecosystems that act as barriers and buffers rather than developing man-made seawalls or similar structures that take up time and money. And this was based initially on a Dow News article that I have shown here, and research done by Dr. Patricia Manuel of Dalhousie, and the other example I have here by Michael Reed, who's also from Dalhousie in Halifax. He published more of an essay style article, and in this he highlights using Halifax Peninsula as a model for understanding the benefits of incorporating historical geographic information systems into modern day coastal management. So while reading Reed's kind of like essay article here, I immediately thought back to the Dow News article because they really do go hand in hand. So incorporating historical GIS into modern coastal management, it works with the newer approach of conserving more natural coasts as much as possible. So Reed discusses how the use of HGIS can provide a more accurate representation of what the landscape would look like before any kind of human alteration, or would look like in a period of less or minimal human alteration. And he kind of states that, the further back in time that researchers have access to the data is the better, and many limitations can come from availability of such resources. And Reed backs up his statements with a case study that unearthed, contextualized, and digitized 4 maps of the Halifax Peninsula that dated from the 4 dates were 1779, 1784, 1841, and 1878. So by digitizing all of this data using HGIS, they created a model of the conditions and features of the landscape across these dates. So this allowed for a more detailed examination of how the landscape would have changed over this time frame. Reed did a good job at pointing out some of the disadvantages of using GIS. So much of the historical data from that far back either doesn't exist or is incredibly difficult to obtain, and when you do obtain it, they have to be credible and contextualized. Otherwise, oftentimes, you don't have much more than just a pretty map. If the scales are skewed or the mapping units are different, it can become a massive challenge to digitize this historic data together into a working framework into GIS, in order to apply it to modern day coastal conservation management and planning. Finally, I'm going to highlight this case study that focuses on ecological research in an environment similar to that of the HRM. So in the paper, the authors state that this is a good model to represent the ways in which GIS can be utilized in ecology and conservation along coastlines. So I'm not going to go over the research in huge detail, but I will focus on the figures and the different visual outputs used by the authors that support their research. So this is just an image of the paper itself and the study area, which is Chongming Island in China, located in the coastal environment between the Yellow Sea and the East China Sea. So the researchers are measuring ecological sensitivity based on landscape patterns across 4 different temporal and spatial scales. These are 2 different visual outputs that the researchers generated to show the different landscape types within the study area. So figure 1 is showing the location and the different land cover types, and this was created with ArcGIS. So this is a fixed scale, but it shows the 4 different temporal scales of 1988, 1995, 2007, and 2017. They compared their land cover data with high-resolution Google Earth images to validate it. And then the second figure is figure 5 in the paper. ArcGIS, the fishnet tool, was used to generate the evaluation units in order to incorporate the spatial scale data. So this is a different form of visual output that they generated, creating the 4 different bar graphs that represent the different landscape types according to the ecological sensitivity index that they created and used, also at the 4 temporal scales. Figure 5 gives a good representation of how visual outputs of geographic data can change when different scales are used. And so basically here what the paper is trying to represent and say the results are summarizing that the wetland vegetation, the woodlands, and farmlands basically have the highest LCI, which is the Landscape Ecological Composition Index rating. That is the y-axis. The x-axis is just the different landscape types. The last 2 figures were focusing on landscape composition, and in the patterns of landscape analysis, the researchers are focusing on composition, configuration, and function. So unlike landscape composition that represented the number and areas of the different landscape types, landscape configuration focuses on the spatial distributions and interrelations of the landscape patches. These 3 figures in the paper are figures 9A, B, and C, and they are summarizing the sensitivity index for the study site over the 3 periods using each of the 4 spatial scales. So the spatio-temporal heterogeneities were driven by different development goals across the island over 3 different periods. So periods 1 to 3 correspond with the agricultural development stage, which was occurring between 1988 and 1995. The initial ecological conservation stage, which was from 1995 to 2007, and then the all-around ecological conservation stage from 2007 to 2017. So the authors use these images to support the fact that spatially the optimal scale would be 200 meters because it's the scale that balances all of the demands of accuracy, spatial heterogeneity, and the appropriate data volume for the study site. So you can see in these maps here that if you look at the scale using 400 or 800 meters, the maps are very pixely. You don't get nearly as much definition and as accurate of representation of the sensitivity across the landscape. So overall, I think this paper is a good example of how GIS can be incorporated into landscape ecology in general, and it provided good visual examples of the types of figures that can be generated using GIS to better understand the patterns and processes that occur across a landscape. And being in a coastal environment, many, if not all, of these techniques could be applied to future research within the HRM, which is a similar environment.